Dr. Rabin, great to see you. Great to have you here.
It's great to be here with you. Thanks so much for having me.
Yeah, listen, I'm a big fan of the work that you've done. I think that with this thesis of vitalism and vitality, the idea of living in parasympathetic dominance is so big in a world where the bolts are always flying. And the work that you've done on this, I think, is really foundational, and I think it's going to really help our audience understand why it's important to manage stress, and then we could get into the how, because that's where the rubber hits the road. So I'd love to just get a little background on kind of just who you are and the work that you've done in this field.
Sure, that's a great place to start. And the autonomic nervous system, including the parasympathetic recovery and stress fight or flight sympathetic system, are really the harmonious balance that we strive for that has inspired a lot of my career and research in terms of stress management. As a psychiatrist and a neuroscientist, been spending a lot of time my career focusing on treating hard to treat mental illness, addiction, and trauma focused. Trauma being a disorder or resulting in a disorder of fear or overactive stress response in our bodies. And this has always been something that's interested me because nobody is completely immune to these kinds of stresses. And we see this when we work with veterans, which was a big part of my uh, patient population for a number of years. And these folks, have had some of the most high levels of training to tolerate stress in the world. And yet, after coming back to civilian life from conflict zones, they struggle to integrate back into Western society. In the majority of folks do. And this was really interesting to me because when we have that much training, you would think that we'd be able to switch quickly between intense stress of conflict and war and coming back to civilian life. But that's not exactly the case. The body struggles to calm down and recover afterwards in a major way. And so this has spurred a lot of my career and my research into effectively how the nervous system works and how stress and trauma over time, if we don't learn the skills to cope with it effectively, which most of us should have been taught as children and weren't, myself included, that it actually has a dramatic impact on our lives and all parts of our lives, from our relationships to our work to our ability to feel safe in our home and our own skin.
I love that. So in order to be able to talk about this, what I'm going to do is kind of the trite Cliff Notes version. It's always like you go talk to a quantum physicist and use the word quantum, you better know math, right? You talk to a neurologist, you start talking about brain centers. What I want to do is colloquialize it enough for folks to understand it. Kind of the common trope out there is, so you have the amygdala, which is kind of the access to fear, and then the hippocampus with the memories, and you stay in those loops and the prefrontal cortex doesn't override. How can we get like a 101 high level of brain centers and what happens, so that then we can use that language to drop in further?
Yeah, absolutely. And the brain centers are actually the brain centers are important, but we don't even need to understand that much about what's going on up here to understand what's going on here, right? Because the mind and the body are intimately connected. And I think this is something that Western medicine and Western science has struggled with over the last couple hundred years. Taking a very rigid Western scientific approach, we're often taught that the mind and the body are separate, and that causes a lot of confusion for people because they are connected, right? When we're feeling physically ill and we don't do anything about it, then we can become mentally and emotionally and spiritually ill. And when we're mentally and emotionally unwell and we don't do anything about it, we can actually become physically ill. So there's a direct connection between both. And it happens all the time. And so, with that in mind, what we're really talking about with stress in a very basic level and chronic stress over time is a resource allocation problem, right? There's only so much blood to go around between our whole bodies and brains. And so, if you think about what happens when we're under stress, like the stress we evolved as animals to deal with, so survival threat is what our fight or flight nervous system evolved over hundreds of millions of years to deal with. It's not just in humans, it's in all all modern animals and ancient animals have the same nervous system. And what happens is when we are exposed to a survival threat, meaning in the moment, lack of air, lack of water, lack of food, lack of physical safety, things of that nature that could threaten our immediate survival, our bodies evolve to immediately take all the available blood and resources and then constrict the vessels that go to organs that aren't important for coping with stress. So that's like the digestive system, the reproductive system, the immune system, the metabolic system, the sleep and recovery and empathy systems. All of those are not that important for escaping from a predator. And so blood flow gets constricted to those organ systems and decreases. And where does that blood go? Well, it goes to the parts that are involved in fight or flight. So that's the skeletal muscles, the motor cortex of the brain, the fear center of the brain, the amygdala you mentioned earlier, and the heart and the lungs, all of the organ systems that are critical in that moment to escape from a survival threat to get to safety. And then once we get to safety, the blood vessels are supposed to relax in the reproductive, digestive, recovery, parasympathetic side of the body to say, hey, we're safe now. So if we're safe, all that blood can go back to recovery systems. But the problem is that we don't have, at least thankfully, we don't have a lot of ancient threats to our survival in our day-to-day life, hopefully. So we're not struggling for air, food, water, shelter, safety in our day-to-day lives, but we are overstimulated all the time with other things like too many emails, too many responsibilities, too many pings, too much news. And that concept of overstimulation to the body, which is simply put too much, too loud, too fast, right, over time, stimulates our bodies, this giant sense organs that we are, and says, hey, there's something you need to pay attention to. There's something new in the environment. And the amygdala starts firing off in thinking that there's newness or uncertainty or threat, and it doesn't actually need to be going off in those moments. We don't want our fear center to be going off and sending all our blood to our heart, lungs, and skeletal muscles and taking it away from our empathy system when we're responding to our boss at a meeting, or when we're answering emails, or when we're with our children and our families, right? We want to be calm and cool and collected and in a present, safe, empathetic state so we can listen to people and connect with them genuinely and not have tunnel vision. And so when there's only so many resources to go around, we want to make sure that we are not depleting our recovery system of resources and also garbage pickup, waste, because blood also carries waste away from organs that are working and cells. So a lot of the stress issues that we have result not from just short-term acute stress in the moment, because our bodies evolved to deal with that. It's what happens when that stress persists over time, moment after moment, day after day. All of our resources are always going to the fight or flight system. So then all the rest of the body is depleted, and it's producing waste. It's trying to work, but it's not having garbage pickup because there's less blood flow, and it's not getting the nutrients it needs to function at its highest level. So we're effectively having a body that we're asking to do all these recovery things, but it's not getting the nutrients it needs. It's not getting the waste removal that it needs. And what happens to us when garbage stops picking up and we stop getting food, right? We don't feel very good. It's actually a really dire situation. So that resource allocation concept of we only have so much blood, let's make sure it's going to the right places, is something we can train ourselves to do over time with a lot of the techniques you talk about. And safety is the foundation of all of that.
One of the metaphors I've used over the years that I think has worked relatively well is wartime economy versus peacetime economy. Peacetime economy, we're talking about school books, roads, bridges, fixing potholes, arts, music. Wartime economy, we see it all over, just turn on the news. And so if the body feels unsafe, if the mind perceives your situation as unsafe, then what I'm hearing here is you're in the wartime economy and the blood's going to, the guns. And so a couple areas where this is profound for vitality. You'd mentioned immunity gets compromised. Um, in and of itself, that is a tragic situation. But let's unpack that. I'm going to lay a couple foundations here. I want to talk about the prefrontal cortex and poor decisions because we're in the mindset day, right? And what happens with those poor decisions. But just on a physiologic level, immunity being compromised, energy systems not getting powered in the right places. Let's talk about that before we go back to the brain.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, and I think that if you look at in the environment as doctors and clinicians, what do we see as the major causes of immune compromise in people? People getting sick too often, people not being having digestive problems, reproductive problems, and not being able to sleep. Just as the four kind of major complaints that many humans have in the Western world, stress is thought to be at least 50% of those problems, right? So, stress and anxiety, the anxiety being the signal that comes from too much stress, too much uncertainty in our environment, feeling out of control, right? And too much of the time. And we're all only in control of so many things, but when we focus our attention on things that we don't have control over, then we start to feel out of control that much more of the time. And feeling out of control is what is going to signal to that uncertainty part of our brains, that amygdala, the fear center, which is detecting fear, but it's really detecting the signals that signal fear, right? So those are uncertainty, newness, right? The things that in 100 million years ago in the jungle, the forest or the prairies would have said, "Hey, there's something I need to pay attention to right now." Right? This new thing that I'm not familiar with, that could be my demise, right? That could end my line. So newness in and of itself becomes something that our brains start to close down to and react to with fear by default. And so when that happens, as you alluded to, our decision making parts of our brains lose resources and prioritize three behaviors, basically: fight, flight, or freeze, play dead, because those are the things that get us away from survival threat to safety, but they don't help us with modern daily stress. And so it's a lot of it is about recognizing this relationship between the mind and the body, and uncertainty being actually and newness being a major trigger of threat that sets us off. And when we're already stressed out, uncertainty, just we shut down to uncertainty, we shut down to the unknown. But when we're in a recovered safe place, all of a sudden we have patience and capacity to what we call explore or investigate or reflect on the unknown, because the unknown is actually where all of the richness of life comes from, right? That's the exciting stuff. That's where we discover new things about ourselves and the world. And so we can't shut down to that, right? If we do, our lives become very much unpleasant and boring. And so identifying this relationship and just understanding that this is what modern neuroscience has to share with the world is that we are in more control than we think, but we need to train our brains to be able to know this relationship of the mind and body and restore control. And that actually has a direct impact of resetting the way that our organs are receiving nourishment and the way that our bodies function. And so it's a very empowering understanding of the mind body that is so promising for so many people.
It's funny, there's a ancient Taoist classic that talks about the sage and the monkey, and both have to hold hands and walk. So we have very primal instincts that come in very handy. This actually reminds me of there's a in North America there was a North American species of camel, and when our ancestors crossed over the Bering Strait, this camel's alarm system didn't go off to say, "Hey, what is that new mammal, walking around, upright?" And so our ancestors were able to just walk up and bop them on the head and eat them until they went extinct, because that alarm signal system that should have been there for this dumb camel wasn't. Right, so it is there. It is there to protect us. But to your point, where's the sage? Where's that balance, and how do we strike it in this modern world where, I mean, look, it's just a barrage between social media. I mean, there's just too much news. Everything is new. And so how does one start to live in the modern world, and establish the right filters so that you're not constantly overwhelmed?
Exactly. And that's why I'm such a fan of the work you do and what you teach and share with the world, because again, we should have been taught these how to train these brain filters as children, and we weren't, because probably our parents didn't realize it was important, and schools didn't realize it was important back then. But this is ancient knowledge of mind control, right? It's ancient knowledge of beyond what we might consider mind control. It's agency, right? So it's agency means being an autonomous agent of our own decisions, being having knowledge and intention behind our actions, like actually getting and understanding what am I tuning into right now? What am I allowing into my awareness? And then what am I putting my human energy into on purpose, right? And if we're doing something, let's do it purposefully. Let's not just do it because it's habit, and or do it because somebody else told us to. Let's actually do it because it's purposeful. There's a goal, or there's a goal in engaging with the process to learn new things. And so, I think one of the common misunderstandings about these conversations around stress is that all stress is bad, right? And and I think what we forget in modern society, because we've learned to avoid discomfort so much and distract ourselves or numb ourselves to discomfort with all the things we have available to do that. Everything from streaming video all the time, or social media, or drugs, alcohol, etc., that decrease or distract ourselves from stress, that we forget that stress in and of itself is the major force that challenges us to grow as human beings. And so stress is inevitable. The real question is, going back to what you asked, is what do we do about it, right? And so training our brains with the mindfulness techniques, the yoga, we talk about kind of four major areas of restoring a sense of control. And this is intentional breathing, intentional movement, intentional touch, and intentional listening. And I would put mindfulness and meditation into that intentional listening category, where we're learning to quiet our minds to just be aware of what's going on, but not judging it, not doing anything about it, not drawing any conclusions about it, just being aware of it and listening to what's going on. And simply by practicing those four techniques, to start, which we can do at any time, right? Breath, movement, listening, and touch, because even if we don't have somebody else, we can give ourselves a hug. These techniques restore a sense of control in our bodies and minds immediately, that train this filter that sits in between. If we're going to go deep brain, sits in between basically where all that incoming information comes in from the outside. So the hippocampus and the thalamus, which is in the lower middle of the brain, before you get to the cortex where long-term memories are stored. And so that filter is often thought of as the claustrum, and it's a thin layer of neurons that prevents certain things from going up into memory because they're not useful or serving us, and they can be discarded, and then allows all the things that are serving us and useful and true to us to kind of come through and sit long term in our long term memory stored in the cortex. So all of these kinds of activities that we do start to retrain that filter to say, hey, if this idea, this thought that's coming to me is not true and useful to me right now, it's not serving me, so it's not allowed through the filter. And we can train that filter over time by doing simple things like questioning our thoughts, right? Like, we don't have to necessarily allow everything in. If you allow thoughts that aren't useful to you into your awareness, then they're like vampires. They will literally suck away your energy and prevent you from having that energy for yourself for the things that are serving you.
Um, so much here. Hold on. First off, if you haven't looked at the day one interviews, look at what Ari Whitten and Jeff Bland talk about for hormesis. If you're listening to this right now, because hormetic stressors turned us from blobs into what we are here listening to this. So not all stress is bad, and the resilience. But okay, so you talked about this thin membrane, this layer that allows us to discern and have agency over what's in and what's out, right? So we have a gatekeeper. And you'd mentioned touch, you'd mentioned conscious listening, you'd mentioned conscious breathing as kind of big parts of that. And then there was a fourth. What was the fourth? Movement.
Intentional movement.
Which is fascinating, because that's why I actually ended up gravitating towards Qigong, because it was eyes, mind, body, and breath. And there's all these places where you touch and breathe at the same time. And it was the first thing that ever worked for me, right?
That's a beautiful discipline.
It's a beautiful discipline, and it's ancient, and but at the end of the day, either it works or it doesn't, right? So if it's working for you, great. If it's not working for you, I tell people to move on, because your nervous system is telling you, I'm still stressed. So hacking into these, there's obviously disciplines for all of these. But let's start with conscious listening and conscious breathing, because that seems like kind of the low hanging fruit, and then I want to move into the others.
Yeah, and they go hand in hand, right? So when we to start the process of intentional breathing, which is probably the first lowest hanging fruit of self control, filtering, brain filtering training techniques that we all should have learned. The simplest practice is not to worry anything about how you're breathing or what rate you're breathing at, but just to be aware of your breath and to feel the air. And this is something that is reflective of a very specific part of the brain that is in higher apes and also some of the higher order animals like dolphins and elephants that have a lot of emotional salience in their lives, and they are involved in a lot of community activities like humans. And it's called the insular cortex, which sits in the center of the emotional nervous system, and it is basically the part of the brain that takes the information that comes in from anything we experience and maps it out to an emotional landscape and stores it as emotional memory. And this is a really interesting part of the brain because it hits directly into that amygdala, that fear center, that says if I'm feeling emotionally soothed, even though what I just touched is sticky or gooey or sharp, or what I'm hearing is too loud and too fast or feels like it might be upsetting, if there's a positive emotional sense of safety in any way that comes from it, that's going to send a signal to that fear center, the amygdala, that says, hey, settle down, buddy. We're safe. It's okay. You don't need to be blasting off right now. And there's 3 layers to the insula that have been discovered over the last 30 years that are really incredible. And they're a map. So the anterior insula is responsible for empathy, feeling what others feel. The mid insula is responsible for interoception, feeling, self-reflection, looking inside ourselves, being aware of our thoughts and our feelings. And then there's that's introspection is the mid layer. That's self-reflection. And then the posterior layer, which goes back to breathing, is interoception. So it's bodily awareness. And bodily awareness is, what does it feel like to listen to my heartbeat? What does it feel like to listen to the air, to feel the air, and just be aware of the feeling of the air coming into my nose, mouth, and windpipes and lungs, and then exiting, right? And how does that change the way I feel in my body? How I'm aware of the air around me and what it feels like on my skin, feeling of my clothes, what I'm sitting on, right? And all of that bodily awareness is interoception. And so these are critical hardwired parts of our brains that we're all born with. Every single human has these parts of their brains in our heads. And yet we don't practice them because we don't necessarily taught they exist. And so a lot of people are living throughout the world thinking, I can't feel what other people feel. I'm not empathetic. I can't self reflect. I can't feel my body. I'm numb to my body. But that just means we haven't trained those pathways through the practice of listening and breathing. And so listening and breathing are really the foundation of all of it. And it just starts by saying, okay, rather than letting my body breathe for me like it does every moment of every day, I'm going to take all of the conscious awareness that I have and just focus it on, and it's easier if you close your eyes, and just focus it on the feeling of the air just coming in and filling your body. It's like the core of our life force. It's the thing we can't exist without in any moment. And it's just focusing on that and then doing it and breathing consciously, breathing intentionally because we decided to, not because the environment told us to. And that simple practice is the foundation of restoring our minds back into our bodies, centering our minds back into our bodies. And it's the fundamental practice of interoception. And this trains self-control. When the environment, when the environment is always telling our bodies what to do, it's always telling us how to breathe, how fast our heart rate should go, how high our blood pressure should be, where our blood should be flowing, we feel more out of control. So how do you restore control? You start with breath, and breath is literally by directing our attention to our breath. You can do it in as little as 30 seconds. For most people in studies, it takes somewhere from 90 seconds to 240 seconds. This is a really short amount of time, talking 3 to 4 minutes, that you can do these very simple breath awareness practices and restore control back, restore agency back to us in any moment. And this decreases heart rate, it decreases blood pressure, it increases vagal tone, this recovery nervous system activity that we were talking about earlier, the parasympathetic nervous system, and starts to redirect blood flow to the recovery organs and sleep systems and rest systems. And so all of that can literally be controlled at the beginning by just starting to become aware and intentional of your breath and intentionally breathing, which is to me one of the coolest things, because it shows that all this ancient knowledge from the past is actually being proven out by modern neuroscience, which makes a lot of sense.
So here's the $1 trillion question. There was studies that came out, I don't know, about a decade ago showing that meditators after 6 weeks had increased cortical density in, say, the prefrontal cortex from just doing a meditation. Is this an area where we have increased neuroplasticity? If I were to practice awareness on my breath, does this part of my brain grow? If I do more pull-ups, will I be better at pull-ups?
Yes, I think short answer, yes. It's and that's what Eric Kandel won the Nobel Prize for in 2000, right? It's this idea that practice makes mastery across anything we do. So if you are practicing a meditation or mindfulness technique and you're practicing learning to intentionally control your breath, control your mind, and expand your awareness, just like going to the gym and doing bicep curls and boosting your muscle strength, we're boosting the strength of those connections in our prefrontal cortex, in our emotional nervous system, and throughout our brains to function more at the level that we want them to in a way that's serving us. So the answer is yes. At the same time, it's important to note that this also this system of practicing things and getting stronger connections around them exists for things that don't serve us as well, right? So if we are thinking about ourselves as being crappy people, we think about ourselves as being not worthy of love, not good at anything, always being sick, always failing, right? Some of these negative intrusive thoughts that many of us have had at some time of our lives, no fault of our own. Usually it's because we model them from other people we've seen, but if we allow ourselves to go down those lines of thinking, we are strengthening neural networks in those pathways, right? So we want to that's where the intention becomes so important is, am I putting my human energy into thinking about myself being not worthy of love? Or am I putting my human energy into loving myself, listening to my body, and building these mindful connections with myself? Because that's what I actually want to strengthen. That's going to make my life better.
Okay, so I'm loving this, by the way. So a couple areas here. One is in kind of the Western Hermetic tradition. What I just heard is kind of the bed of the subconscious, right? Where you plant either the positive or, that's the soil of the subconscious. So you're saying this part of our neuroanatomy is also where these loops can run and direct who we become because of who we think we are. It's fascinating. I mean, I don't know how much research has gone into the depths of that, but I mean, how does that impact? So how does that relate to our subconscious, as kind of like Freud would have called it?
Yeah, I mean, I think so. So if we think about what is the subconscious is, if you think about, so conscious and subconscious, conscious is what are we aware of at any given moment, and what are we aware of about ourselves and the world. So we can call that like the tip of the iceberg that's sticking out of the water that we can see. And then the subconscious is much more vast than the conscious material. And that's everything beneath the surface of the water. So in the iceberg metaphor, that might be 100, 1,000, 10,000 times larger than the part that we just see sticking above the surface. And so when we experience dreams, for instance, which are the most common psychedelic state that any of us as human beings experience, psychedelic meaning revealing our minds to us, revealing our subconscious to us, or showing us what is beneath awareness, right? those experiences are where our survival mind is allowed, that ego conscious mind is allowed to settle down, and because it knows it's safe enough to settle down, it doesn't need to be active when we're in deep and restful REM sleep. And that allows us to start to create little ripples in the water that allow us to see beneath the surface and see different parts of that subconscious iceberg that is typically not within our awareness. Because if survival wise, right, if we were aware of what's above the water and the 10,000 times more that's beneath, it would be really hard to focus on anything, right? We would be distracted by all that stuff underneath the surface all the time. So there are good reasons for why we have this kind of filter between conscious awareness and subconscious awareness. But the subconscious material is still real, right? That stuff that gets stored underneath the surface is real. It's part of us. It's just as important a part of us as the part of us we're aware of. So so a lot of the work we do in mental health, in psychology, in modern psychology, is about, and since you mentioned Freud, it's about how do you help somebody feel safe enough to drop into what's beneath the surface and start to view some of that subconscious material that might have been stored over time that we're not aware of anymore on a daily basis. Because it is important material, it may be governing our awareness. It may be having a dramatic influence on the way that we interact with others and the way we see ourselves, but we're not aware of it because we've learned it and practiced it for so long that it's dropped down beneath our awareness now. It's practiced, right? It's trained. And so, like anything, like we're automating behavior and thought process all the time to the point where we don't have to think about the feeling of our clothes on our body anymore because we've been wearing clothes for decades, right? If we were aware of that all the time, it would be distracting. So we tune it out. And that's the same with negative thoughts about ourselves or negative thoughts about the world. So starting to do the therapeutic work, and I think neuroscience is still catching up with this in large part through the study of psychedelics, which allow us, psychedelic medicines, which allow us to, for a certain amount of time, help people become rapidly aware of subconscious material. But ancient techniques and modern psychology over the last 50 100 years has been helping people heal by expanding subconscious awareness for a really long time. And it's where that subconscious and the conscious material meet that feels vulnerable. It feels sometimes uncomfortable because there's stuff down there that we don't necessarily find very soothing or pleasurable, but it's at that vulnerable interface where all healing exists. Like that's where the good stuff is, right? And it's by becoming aware of our blind spots and the stuff that makes us feel uncomfortable inside that helps us to expand our awareness and our capacity as human beings, and then help us to rewire the parts of our brains around those things so that we're functioning the way we want to, not maybe the way we were taught. We're seeing ourselves the way we actually are, not necessarily the way we were taught to see ourselves. Does that make sense?
It makes a lot of sense, but it's also such a confusing time. I feel like a bomb went off with all this psychedelic assisted stuff because, in the old days, you'd sit there on the sofa and talk about all your stuff and do, cognitive behavioral and, set the table and coping mechanisms and all this stuff to create safety so that then you could go in. And now you just go to Burning Man and drop something and you're in this like free fall of I don't know without any support and any of the safeguards that were there. And I know you speak at some of these conferences. I know you're an expert in that space as well. So I would love to hear your opinion about how this psychedelic assisted realm. I mean, there's obviously incredible benefits that have come, but there's also, this whole body of work that's been kind of ushered aside that is kind of baby bathwater in some ways. So where do you see it fitting in? Like, how do we help someone feel safe before delving into the undercurrent of the subconscious and get the results we want?
That's a fantastic question because that is what separates very radically healing psychedelic experiences, whether drugs are involved or not, from psychedelic experiences that people refer to as bad trips or traumatizing, right? And the safety is really the key because if we go back to the folks who have been studying psychedelics for the longest time, like the psychiatrist Stan Grof and many others from back in the 40s and 50s, they coined the term psychedelic to mean mind revealing, right? Again, so it's not drug related, but it's a state of being, which could be in a dream, or it could be in hypnosis, or it could be in a meditation or a yoga experience or flow. And it could also be induced molecularly by a drug, right? And so that understanding of what that experience is, and that it can be naturally achieved or augmented and achieved with the assistance of a substance, is really critically important. The drug is not required, right? And so if we understand that, then the what you know then what Stan Grof said, after one of the first people to study LSD, described psychedelics as non-specific amplifiers of awareness, right? So what does that mean? So that means that you take a medicine, and that medicine is increasing activity in our brains in certain areas that make us aware of all that subconscious material beneath the surface, right? That giant iceberg metaphor we were talking about, it ripples the water in all these different ways molecularly. And then we start becoming aware of all this stuff. We start seeing all the stuff beneath the surface. Some of it is going to be really exciting and happy and pleasant and all about, all the love and joy that is inside of us. And other parts of it may be about the suffering and the pain that's inside of us, and things that have happened to us in the past that we've buried deep down, that we don't actually have that much of a desire to remember on a daily basis. And so that's the vulnerability that we were talking about earlier. So that stuff that we buried deep down, that stuff that causes us pain, is actually stuff that's governing a lot of our behaviors in our day-to-day lives. Why? Because we as human beings and as animals evolve to avoid pain, right? When we know that something's going to cause us pain, we do things to avoid it in any way we can. That's just kind of the go-to path. And so if you take a psychedelic medicine in an environment where you're not safe to explore the pain or to explore the memories that are associated with painful emotions or discomfort, and then that discomfort or that pain surfaces, or those memories surface at Burning Man, or at a dance party, or at a place where you're around a bunch of people that you don't necessarily feel safe around to unveil or work through that pain and allow it to come to the surface, because it's coming to the surface for a reason. It wants to be addressed. Then people tend to shut it down and repress it and say, no, 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 I'm not ready for that. I don't want to deal with that right now. But that's not, the memories don't care if you're ready for it or not. The memories are like, we need to be addressed, right? We're here, we're knocking, right? We need to be addressed. We need your attention right now. And if we resist it, as the Buddhists say, resistance in large part is the fastest path to suffering, right? Because when we resist what is, that stuff that's coming up just keeps knocking at the door, and it keeps saying, hey, pay attention to me, pay attention to me. When something's commanding our attention, that's anxiety. And if we don't do anything about it, then that anxiety starts to come out as negative thought loops, right? In your psychedelic experience. And that's what people call a bad trip. So I can tell you, in my practice and the way that we work in the clinic with people, we've never had anybody have a bad trip. Why? Because we spend so much time with them before they even touch medicine, preparing them to be excited about whatever's going to come up, because that's what they're here to explore. They're seeing us and working with us in our safe container to dive into vulnerability and to explore that little gray, or that big gray area for some people, that is filled with discomfort and pain that they might not remember. And when you create that safe space for people, whether it's in a lineage trained shamanic setting, or an Eastern, meditation retreat setting, or a Western clinical psychedelic setting with ketamine therapy, for instance, that you can help people access that subconscious material safely. And then when it comes up, they're like, I'm ready for this, right? I'm ready to show love to this part of myself, to show gratitude to this part of myself, because this is what I'm here to find out about myself. And it changes the entire thought process about what people see when they see it, what they think when they see it, and then what they do about it after. that actually results in the long-term healing, which is really cool.
I love this. I think of, I spent a good part of my 20s playing tow truck to bad trippers, who, just people make stupid decisions. I'm going to go do mushrooms at Disneyland and end up in a security office. That'll make me feel safe, right? and,
Oh God.
and honestly, I think one of the best tools I gifted myself in early life was Vipassana training and understanding that the aversion from pain and whatever has come up is what you're to be looking at and not to run right now. But nobody has that training, right? And so fundamentally, people are ill equipped to set the table to look at this stuff, to feel safe. So I know a lot of people, and it's so popular now, right? It's like, oh, I'm going to go do psychedelic assisted therapy and all my problems go away. How do you set the table? How do you set your daily hygiene? How do you, not mistake the map for the terrain in this world where everyone's like, oh, here's the next Hail Mary, let's go?
Yeah, I love that metaphor of mistaking the map for the terrain. I've talked to Jamie Wheel about that quite a bit, and it's a fascinating metaphor. And I think the way that we do it is in try to condense it as short as possible with our clients, because people are busy and they don't have a lot of time, and it comes down to, I think, the fundamental practice of self gratitude, and really inviting that into our lives as if it were a muscle we were training in the gym, right? Similar to, you go to the gym or you wake up and you're like, I'm going to do my push ups today. I'm going to do my bicep curls today. I'm going to strengthen those parts of my body. What about just waking up and saying, I'm going to try to find as many things as I can to be grateful for today, inside myself and in my life, right? And the more things that we find that we can be grateful for, the stronger our gratitude muscles get. And so that simple practice, there's a lot more that people can do, of course. Like we talked about, the behavior practices like intentional breathing, intentional movement, listening, touch, all of these soothing techniques that restore control. Those are really important. But it all starts with the practice of self-gratitude. And that is something that also many of us have not been taught to the level of importance that it is. I actually never really appreciated it fully until I studied for a brief time with the Shipibo people in Peru, studying traditional ayahuasca ceremony, where they talk about these four pillars of effectively rebuilding or strengthening the foundation of trust in ourselves, which is what trauma fractures. Trauma fractures self trust. That's why it's so hard to recover from. If I got myself into this shitty situation, there's a good chance I could get myself back there. So why should I trust myself to manage this, right? And it creates a sense of self distrust. And Gabor Mate talks about this a lot too. And so the idea being, how do we repair the foundation of trust? It's four things: self gratitude, in order, four things: self gratitude, self forgiveness, self compassion, and self love. And that by practicing these four things, these thought emotional exercises, skills, as often as we can, wherever we are, starting with self gratitude, then when we face things that make us uncomfortable in our day to day regular sober life, or under the influence of a psychedelic medicine, rather than saying impulsively, why me, right? The thing that so many of us ask, why is this happening to me right now, right? You've seen that shirt, the shit happens shirt, right? Every religion has its own way that it describes the why me. And that's what we've been trained to ask, but that's not the right question, right? We don't want to ask questions that are going to give us answers that are not the answers we're looking for. That sets us up for failure. It sets us up for suffering. We want to be asking the question of, what can I be grateful for about this challenge I'm facing right now, right? This thing that I'm experiencing in the psychedelic state feels really uncomfortable. It's not something I thought I was signing up for today, but can I find a way to be grateful for some part of this challenging experience, or anything about it that helps me to lean into it and to try to find out, what is this trying to teach me today? right? And that goes back to ancient Buddhist techniques too, right? Of this idea that my greatest challenge, like you think about the person who causes the most challenge in your life, and that is your greatest teacher, right? Very different from the Western approach of think about the person who causes the most challenge in your life and run the other way.
Yeah, or hate them or judge them, or then try to forgive them. It's funny. I think
Right.
Ramana Maharshi's take on the why me is that, that is an absolutely wrong question. The better question is who am I, and then who asked that question. So the question of awareness, we kind of danced around it a little bit as you were talking about the brain centers that become aware of our breathing and kind of that introspection of turning inward to become aware of our heartbeat and our movement. Um, in this, so people listening to this, people watching us right now, they're trying to find their vitality. It's been this elusive thing. They've watched all the podcasts, they've read the stuff, and they're still kind of stuck, right, in this world of orthorexia and too much information. So, how do we bring our awareness back to become self aware, feel safe, and then set the table for a lifestyle and habits that actually beget vitality?
So I think the first step is, you know, coming from what we were just talking about, the first step is this gratitude practice, right? It's a thing you can take with you anywhere. You can do it anytime. When you like all of us as humans are experiencing stress in your day-to-day lives or things that make you uncomfortable, like we all do on a regular basis, try your best to just find things about your experience, about yourself to be grateful for in any moment. The more things that we can be grateful for, the more grateful we feel and the more grace we ultimately live with, right? And so that is truly foundational. And
Quick
then,
question on that. Is
yeah,
that kind of the positive override on the negative self-talk that meets us at our subconscious? Is that at that level to kind of reprogram
yeah,
the negative self-talk?
yeah, I think so. And I think we see that in some early neuroscience studies of gratitude practice where people with terminal illnesses and things where they're like, why should I be grateful about anything? Like I'm dying, I'm suffering every day. And that having something to believe in, something to be grateful for, even if your belief is in gratitude itself, right? That in and of itself dramatically improves people's ability to live well at the end of life and through these ultimately incredibly challenging situations. And I think that we often in therapy we call it the gratitude interception, right? Because it's literally catching yourself for judging yourself, for instance, and saying, hey, wait a minute, I can I have two choices now. I just noticed I'm judging myself. I can now judge myself for judging myself and fall into the judgment trap, or I can express gratitude for the awareness that I'm judging myself and stop the cycle, right?
Love that. Love that. Reminds me of
And then from there, it's practicing those techniques that we talked about earlier, which restore our sense of control over ourselves and over how we feel in our awareness. And those are the intentional breathing, taking control of our breath, intentional movement, taking control of our movement, intentional listening, and intentional touch. And we can do those in any moment. And then the two that follow that are critically important that we talk about a lot are nourishment, intentional nourishment. So being aware of what you're putting into your body. You would never put crappy fuel into your high performance vehicle. And this is the highest performance vehicle we'll ever have in our lives, right? So don't put bad fuel into this. This cannot run with bad fuel. So we need to be intentional about our nourishment and about our rest and recovery and sleep. And that's the last one. And so the first four I always focus on because those are the things you can do literally anytime, anywhere you are. The movement, the breathing, the listening, the touch. We can do those anytime and they're free, and you can practice them over time and get really good at them. But as we do them, we're basically restoring agency. We're restoring our own inner power to be able to control our attention, what comes in, and to be able to control our intention, where we are putting our energy out.
So we live in a world where someone just heard that and would be dying to hear about some pill that allowed them to not have to sit there and worry about their conscious intention, their breathing, their awareness, and all that. Because, oh my God, that sounds like work. So I want to kind of double down or double click on what you just said there to emphasize. And the crux of this conversation is I am so accustomed to being unaware that the turning of my awareness back to cultivate my awareness feels foreign. Therefore, the advertiser said this pill will fix that. So I want to spend a second double clicking on that, because that to me is, one of the major issues we're facing in this health and wellness sphere.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm so glad you mentioned that, because it is one of the most major issues. And I think that if you go, the way I'll answer that is, if you go back, and I'm a huge medicine history fan, and if you go back into ancient Eastern techniques, Ayurveda, yoga, Chinese medicine, you go back to tribal medicine, you go back to Hippocrates, the founder of Western medicine, Maimonides, right? These great minds that are so well respected, and their lineage is passed down to today, right? And they all say the same darn thing, which is that healing, the source of healing, comes from within each of us, right? It comes from within those seeking to be healed, right? And so a pill, or your therapist, or the hospital, or your doctor, or your technology, these can be great tools that augment our inner healing process, but they're not the healer. The healer is right here, right? This is the healer. And if we deny or train ourselves to believe that we don't have the ability to heal, or that we can't heal for whatever reason, then we give up that power to heal ourselves. And that makes us feel even more unsafe. So a lot of these techniques are that we use, and even in modern psychology, we always talk about this with our patients, like, it's up to you. I can help you, I can guide you through this process, but it's up to you to actually make the change in your life, regardless of what medication you're taking, regardless of what pills you're told could solve all of your problems. It's up to you to remember that comes from within here, and not from me, not from the doctor, not from the clinician, not from the pill. And there's a very dangerous slippery slope that most people fall into, particularly in the Western world, where we learn or are taught that we have to rely on something outside of ourselves for healing, whether it's a person or a thing or a pill, right? We are taught to rely on that as a source of healing. And that does something very dangerous, which is it externalizes the healer. It takes the idea of where healing comes from out of here, and puts it out here, right? And so what is that doing? Very simply put, it's taking power from our ability to heal ourselves from in here, and we're putting it out here, because now we're believing, and we're trained to believe that that source of healing is outside of us, not inside of us. So a big part of why I talk about this stuff so much is because modern neuroscience has shown that and modern psychology, right? We know the source of healing comes from here. Let's stop questioning it, right? Let's stop messing with people by accident, or not teaching them properly about where the source of healing comes from. We know where it comes from. Everything outside of here is a tool that can augment healing.
I mean, it's almost like modern idolatry, and we have given our power of self healing away to the detriment of our health, and therefore our vitality is lacking. Um, Vitality comes from
Nailed it.
within. There's so much. I'm such a fan of your work. As a matter of fact, I wear the Apollo Neuro daily. Why? So here we go. A guy who is a monk, a guy who constantly is focusing on his breath and his awareness, and is aware of this and does this for hours a day, still wears a touch device that tells my nervous system it's cool, it's safe. Why? Because there's too many bullets flying and the world is coming. Now, is this the healer? No, I'm the healer. But can I use the tools as part of my Batman tool belt to keep the bullets at bay and keep myself where I need to be so that I can have the agency to be the dad they deserve and, the citizen the world deserves. Yes, of course. So I know we're running out of time. I want to talk about touch healing and the work that you've done around that, because I think that it's incredibly impactful, and it's a great shortcut and tool to help us get to the promised land faster and then learn how to fish.
Yeah, and that is a great segue. And I think that idea of safety and internalizing, remembering where healing comes from, is a big part of why we developed Apollo as a tool. Because Apollo is a device that delivers soothing touch sensation to the body, using sound waves, and it works anywhere on your body. You wear it on your wrist, I wear it on my ankle or chest, and what's interesting about that is that, going back to the very beginning of this conversation about stress, fear, and safety, when if healing is something foreign to us, right, then it's new, and newness brings uncertainty. And so why would we sign up if we're already not feeling good or stressed out or overwhelmed, too many bullets flying around? Why would we sign up for more newness in our lives, even though it might make us, even though we're told it's going to heal us? It's still biologically scary, right? And so we created Apollo, and we saw this with our patients all the time. And this seemed to be, to us, a big part of the reason why people weren't getting better. And they were all reliant on the pills. They would come to our office every day and say, "Why is this pill not making me better?" Because it's not going to make you better. It's just going to help you make you better. And it's supposed to reinforce your practices. And that model just wasn't working for the gross majority of our patients. Like, over 70% of people were not responsive to the Western treatments we were taught to use, and especially for PTSD. And so we started working on ways that we could give people something that they could take out of the office that was safe, that also reminded us that we're safe in our own bodies, and that our bodies are safe enough to heal and safe enough to send the blood and the resources we need to all of the recovery organs that know how to heal us, right? If it's just a resource allocation problem, and that's kind of one of the leading theories of how our nervous systems regulate themselves with respect to stress and recovery, then if we help do anything to help ourselves feel safe, whether it's soothing touch from Apollo, or intentional breathing, or intentional movement, or gratitude practice, or any of these things, then, or meditation, mindfulness, if you do those practices, you're reminding your body that it's safe enough to heal. It's safe enough to sleep. It's safe enough to be vulnerable, right? And that is where technologies like Apollo become really interesting, because it's not fixing the problem for us. It's reminding our bodies that we're safe enough to engage our own natural ability to fix the problem and to start to heal.
I love that. Vitality comes from within. It's an emergent energy. It's a state of being. Can't go there unless you feel safe. You can't sleep if you're not feeling safe. You can't digest properly if you're not feeling safe. You can't make good decisions unless you're feeling safe. So feeling safe has to happen. Doc, I know we're out of time. I'm a big fan of your work again. Um, really appreciate the work that you've done in the field, and really, I invite you back anytime, because these discussions are just very, very juicy. So thank you.
It's my pleasure. This was great.